we're going to cover a few things like you. Since this is the 40th anniversary of CSICOP, a little bit about the beginnings of that, your investigations, your life, and apart from that, I don't know what else we'll do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's roar right ahead.
Yeah, okay. And it's such a delight for me to be here with you.
Oh,
Our paths have happily intersected a number of times over these 4 decades. And boy, we've had some good times in various places around the world. Randy used to stay at our house when he visited in my city, coming to Sandia National Labs. We've been in executive council meetings together over many years, and several really interesting trips together.
Yes. Indeed.
Wow. When I got involved with this group at the original founding conference with Paul Kurtz, you were there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think Ray was there, Jim Alcock was there. But before that, we've learned in recent years that you and Martin Gardner and Ray Hyman, particularly those 3 of you, were really trying to come up with some sort of organized enterprise to deal with paranormal nonsense and psychic flim-flam in the society. Tell me a little bit about how you became aware of each of those other people and how your interests intersected there.
Well, there was another fellow involved, L. Vosburgh Lyons. Have you ever heard that name?
No.
Well, he was in at the beginning. He was our legal advisor, and he volunteered to serve in that capacity. And he didn't have much of a profile after that. But, of course, the other folks that you mentioned were very instrumental in promoting the idea of getting a foundation ready to handle the whole situation of the so-called paranormal. And I know Martin Gardner for many decades, of course.
Decades.
Oh, yes. I miss him more than most people who have passed on, I can tell you. Martin was an astonishing man. How many of you are familiar with Martin Gardner's works? Oh, look at that. Oh, Martin, you feel pretty good? Martin, you feel pretty good about that? I must tell you something, though. Kendrick, I don't know whether I've ever told you this, and perhaps during this conflab here, I did tell you previously, but pardon me if I did. I'll tell the rest of the audience. Martin Gardner often spoke to me by telephone when I lived in New Jersey and he lived in Croton-on-Hudson. And even later when I moved off to Florida, of course, I'd get calls from him every now and then. I must say, usually with a very lame joke. He started with a very lame joke. He was not a humorist. But, sorry, Martin. He called me one day, we were chatting away, and there was a pause on the other end of the line. He said, "Randy, I have to tell you something." I said, "Yes?" And I thought, uh-oh, what can this be? He told me, "I'm a deist." Now, a deist is someone who has a basic belief in a God, okay, of any shape or form, I don't know what, but or if any shape or form at all. But a deist is someone who has an interest in a superior power of some kind. And I was sort of stunned at that, because those of you who are familiar with the way Martin wrote and what he said in his various books, no TV appearances. He never, that I knew of, ever appeared on television. Very, very shy. But for him to say that he was a deist, as I say, was a shock and a surprise to me. And he said, "But let me tell you this." I listened carefully. He said, "I have no evidence whatsoever to support my belief in a God. None." He said, "You have all the evidence to the contrary. I've read it, I've read what you've said, I've heard what you've said, I've read books and books and books on it, they have all the reason on their side, the people who say there is no God. And I interrupted, I said, Martin, I've never claimed there's no God because I can't prove that. He said, no, I know that's your stance, and it always has been my stance. I don't say there is no God because I can't prove there is no God. I merely say I don't see enough evidence in nature to believe in a deity. And he said, but I tell you again, you have the whole case in the bag. I have no evidence to support my view at all. But that's the kind of guy that Martin Gardner was. He would state the whole case or nothing about it whatsoever. And I said, Martin, if that makes you comfortable, and he said, yes, it does. And he said, that's why I have that belief. It makes me a little more comfortable about my life. I said, that's all I need. You're a good friend. You're an excellent friend, longtime friend. All I need to do is hear you say that, and I accept that that is your conviction, and I won't argue with you about it. And he just said, thank you. And that's the way Martin Gardner was. And I meant what I said, and I still mean it. I was quite satisfied to hear him say that. If it gave him comfort, I was all for it.
In later years, I heard some criticism of him from skeptics about that, but it goes to what Jamie was asking the other day. I think the skeptic community can certainly deal with a deist in the house, can't we not?
Well, to a certain extent, except I think maybe they belong to the fringes. I'm not too sure. I simply have a very hard time, Kendrick. I might as well get this off my chest. That's not on my chest. At the very beginning, I think that the belief in a deity is such first of all, unprovable claim, and such a rather ridiculous claim. And I really look at it as ridiculous. I think it's an easy way out to explain things to which we have no answer. And there are many things, folks, to which we have no answers. No question to that. I think you'll all agree on that. But for instance, there was this girl. No, I won't go into that. That's another detail. But I just think that a belief in a God is one of the most damaging things that infests humanity at this particular moment in history. It may improve, and I see signs that it may be improving. And I'll leave it at that.
Now, at that time that we're talking about, the 70s, it was just a rampant sense of paranormal credulity in the media and the popular culture. I don't know whether it's changed that much since. It's changed in certain ways. But back then, what was it that you and Ray and a few others wanted to accomplish? You were writing your book on Uri Geller at that time.
Yes.
And I had...
Oh, that fella, yeah.
I had heard from Martin Gardner when I was editor of Science News magazine, who was displeased with a couple of articles we had done on paranormal themes. We did our best. We tried to do a good job of science reporting on them, and one was on Geller. But Martin said we hadn't done a very good job. When he wrote me a long letter, and I answered back saying, because I knew who he was. I'd read his Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. I loved it. I thought it was an extraordinary book. I still do today. I reread it every now and then. And I said, we need a group of people like you and skeptics to help educate us science editors on these bizarre claims that the public is fascinated with, but there's not good scientific information on. So, as you know, then, I was delighted when in 1976 I heard from Paul Kurtz's group that they were founding an organization which turned out to be CSICOP. And you were a founding fellow, and Ray Hyman was, and Jim Alcock came along very soon, and Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov, a whole bunch of those people. What did the founding of that organization in 1976 mean? Did it help support your efforts? Did it help bring cohesion a little bit to, the whole enterprise?
Yes, that's very true. We had to have an organization going. Now, the way it happened, actually, well, you're quite correct in your summary of it, but I must say that at first, I got the offer right during one of the first meetings. They said, and of course you'll be the head of it, the main figure. And I stopped. I said, no, I'm in showbiz. I'm a magician. Ho ho ho. I'm a theatrical character. I work on TV and in theaters and whatnot, and I go out and entertain kids and adults. An entertainer should not be the head of an organization like that. I said, however, I do know of this gentleman, it was Paul Kurtz that I was speaking of, and I said, he has made a lot of very good statements about believing in the paranormal and the supernatural, and I said we should approach him, and we did approach him, and Paul graciously agreed to accept the position, and that's the way it turned out. But having been asked that way, I was rather frightened for the future of the organization if they took me to head them up, because that's you have to have an academic. You have to have somebody who has some standing and a decent desk. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, not only for your little capsule summary about Martin Gardner, which you've sort of given already, but also Ray Hyman, who's here with us in the room tonight, and then Paul Kurtz, who is a different kind of person, but it helped the combination of all these different perspectives and backgrounds helped bring some solidity to the organization and the executive council, would you say?
Paul was a very good first of all, an excellent academic in so many ways. He proved that many, many times. Well, with all of his books, of course, beautiful books that he wrote, very concise and very factual and very convincing, very convincing. Don't ever hesitate to open up a Paul Kurtz book and read a chapter out of it. It's always inspiring. But the fact that he was an academic connected with a university, and he had the time and he had the interest, certainly that was very important. The interest in such an organization, I thought was ideal. And Paul Kurtz worked out very, very well. Very, very well, I must say.
I want to ask you about one other key figure in the skeptical movement who's less well-known and appreciated today, but was very much in the public eye back then, and that is Isaac Asimov.
Oh.
Now, he wrote the foreword to your book, Flim Flam.
Yes, he wrote the foreword to a couple of my books, as a matter of fact. But Isaac Asimov, that's a name to conjure with. There's no question of it. Isaac Asimov. There's a wonderful illustration of him sitting in a huge throne. You've seen it, I'm sure. Sitting about like this in a huge throne, and he belonged that way. Now, mind you, pardon? Yeah, mind you, Isaac, none of his relatives here, I hope, he was scared to death of flying.
Yes.
I'm not talking about this kind. I'm talking about run through the air. He was scared to death of flying. We had to talk to him for a full day to get him convinced that he could fly to California and back.
Ooh, that's a big trip.
Oh, no, that's heavy. That's heavy. And I think he was white-knuckled all the way, holding onto the seat. I don't know. I wasn't there, so I shouldn't surmise that. But here's a man who's dealing with rocket ships and traveling to the moon and to Mars and to other galaxies and whatnot with that great imagination of his. But that he was afraid of flying.
Well, you know, what he said was he didn't have to go anywhere because he could go in his imagination.
Well, you don't pick up many people pickles for doing that sort of thing. Yeah, okay, that's a good philosophy. Sure.
But he was such a phenomenal, prolific writer. Novels, both novels and nonfiction of science. He was my science teacher growing up with his books of nonfiction about science, his books of essays, that came out every about 16 months, a new one.
Yeah.
And so when he was associated with this fledgling group, CSICOP, to me that also gave it immense
Great
status
prestige.
and authority,
Yeah.
as well as the lesser-known academics who were with it. Yeah.
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, traveling the world as I used to do a great deal, I'm going to Austria to get an award in a few weeks too. I have no idea. Maybe a basket of apples or something. I don't know. Something or other is coming my way. So I'm doing some more traveling. But I travel first class now. I sit down in the seat and I wake up and they've landed. That's great. That's the way I want to fly. You bet. But Isaac, what was I heading for now? What was I trying to tell you? You don't know because I didn't tell you.
I'm not psychic.
It was about flying or whatever.
We can get back to it. You'll think of it in a moment.
Okay.
I did want to ask about one other key figure back then at the time who turned out later to be a bit of a burr under our saddle, and that was Marcello Truzzi.
You just said a dirty word.
Who is the first co-chairman, actually, of CSICOP with Paul Kurtz, and then the first editor of the Zetetic, which a year later, when I became editor, we renamed the Skeptical Inquirer.
Yeah, it was known as a Zetetic scholar at one time.
Well, that was his later manifestation of it after he left.
That's right. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And Zetetic means skeptic, essentially, does it not?
Yeah. Yes. Essentially, it means
Any Latin
skeptical inquirer. So it's a Greek,
ancient
Greek
Latin
form of that.
Yes, Marcello was a strange guy in many ways. We had to take him off the job simply because he insisted that we should have an equal number of pages from the pro-paranormal people and an equal number of the anti-paranormal people. You can't do a magazine like that. That's ridiculous. You have two completely different philosophies in the same book and opposing one another. No, that was not doable.
That was the core of the dispute, as I understood it, because it was his departure that led to my entrance into this whole activity.
Oh,
yes. Actually, the same.
And we're very happy with that arrangement, don't you think?
But he was an interesting person. He was a sociologist of science at Eastern Michigan University. Yeah. And recently, I have learned that an entire book of correspondence between Marcello Truzzi and Martin Gardner is about to be published by the editor of the Martin Gardner Letters. And it's called Dear Martin, Dear Marcello.
Wow. And where did you learn about this?
Well, from the editor, Dana Richards sent me a thing to try to do a blurb for it.
Oh, wow.
So I've done it. It's fascinating, and it was amazing to me the volume of correspondence that Martin Gardner and Marcello Truzzi engaged in, starting in around 1973 and going up into the 1980s. I don't know. I'm only halfway through all of it. When they started expressing the tensions, and Martin by then, or Marcello had left the organization and had his Zetetic scholar, but they debated. They must have had. There's an entire. The first section's about CSICOP. The second section is about the demarcation problem, which is arcane debates about how you define what is science and what is pseudoscience and what that fine line is in between. And they would go on and they would write like 4-page single-space letters, and the day the other one got it, Marcello say, he would write back a 4-page letter, and then Martin would write back a 5-page letter, and it's an amazing amount of correspondence that I think will contribute to the history of the skeptical movement and the history of science when it becomes published.
Now, really.
Yeah, I didn't know if you know about that yet.
I hadn't heard of this at all.
Anyway, it'll probably bring the name Marcello Truzzi back a bit into the conversation, but it'll be a new book of correspondence by Martin Gardner, which is something to be...
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
all by itself.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Well, how would you describe CSICOP in those early years? What we were doing, what we did, what it accomplished, if you think it did anything?
We had a lot of exchange of information with the press, and I think with the media in general. This is before television was really the big thing that it is now, of course. And I think we had a very substantial influence on the printed media, particularly the printed media in those days. There was so much nonsense, and is even today, so much nonsense coming out in the printed media and TV on science and the difference between that and quackery and whatnot, a thing that occupies me in my 11th book, which is yet to be published, but very shortly. I'm sure you'll all want a copy, of course, at the usual price. But that's what we were concerned with. We had to make a bite. We had to get into the media. We had to know what they were talking about. And I know that I exchanged a great number of personal letters with individual columnists. I found that was the way to go. And I made contact with Johnny Carson, and I found out immediately that he was on our side, very much on our side. He wasn't only a comedian, ladies and gentlemen. He was a great thinker. As a matter of fact, I should just for a moment break away, but to tell him that the staff at The Tonight Show, whenever I walked in, they start to whisper about me because there was a peculiar thing that happened every time I appeared on the show. That Johnny had a firm rule that he didn't want to meet anyone who was going to be on the show before they actually walked through that curtain over to the desk. That was a rule with him because he wanted to be a fresh approach, you see. But with me, I would always get on the door about 5 or 6 minutes before they actually started the taping, because it was taped several hours before it actually was broadcast, of course, for editing purposes. And I knew what that was, and I'd answer the door, and I'd see people staring over John's shoulder like this, looking around. Who could that be? Because John wanted to come around. He was so thoughtful and kind to me. And he just simply asked, what should I mention? What do you want me to plug? What do you want me to emphasize? What do I say if I'm asked so-and-so? He wanted to be aware of how he could help me. He liked me and he liked what I did. We got to be very close. And and the night that we exposed Peter Popoff.
Yes.
Peter Popoff. We got him, and we got him good. Oh yeah. I'm sure that all of you know that on different television channels, very small ones, someplace or other, you can always find those Peter Popoff broadcasts, and the one with Carson is a gem. But as soon as we finished doing that exposure, I was sitting at the desk, at the front desk, and the audience was leaving. And Fred DeCordova, the producer of the show, he walked over to the desk and he looked down at the two of us, and we were chatting, and we both looked up, and Fred was standing there, and he said, "We're going to get letters." And John said, "Yes, Fred, and you're going to answer them." And DeCordova said, "Yeah," and just walked away shaking his head, because there were hundreds of letters that poured in from all over the country and Canada, and a few from Mexico as well, because that program carried like crazy in the early days. So that was one episode that I will never forget.
Well, that was one of your most memorable investigations, there's no doubt, and we'll talk about a few more of those. I want to get back to your beginnings in this whole area. You were a famed illusionist, a magician, escape artist, but what is it that made you turn to skepticism? Or do you see that as part of that? Or is it, what made you a skeptic?
Since I was a kid, I had been very skeptical. I got my introduction to religion when my my parents who slept in every Sunday, and I had a brother and sister very much younger than myself. And at the age of 11 or 12 or so, I was initiated into Sunday school. That almost finished Sunday school for the whole universe. But I was given a quarter by my father. And in those days in Canada, a 25-cent piece was a lot of money. You could buy quite a bit for that, believe me, especially if you were a kid. And he pressed a quarter into my palm and went right back to sleep. He said, put that on the collection plate. I went to Sunday school on Sunday morning in St. Cuthbert's Church on Bayview Avenue in Leaside, Toronto, Canada. So there, check it out. I'm sure they've got a picture of me on the wall still, I think, with darts in it. And I went off to Sunday school, and I dutifully put my quarter on the plate. And then they started to read to me from the Bible. And I interrupted and said, excuse me, how do you know that's true? It sounds strange. And it's in the Bible. It's in the holy book of God. Oh, okay. I looked around, they were all staring at me and said, what kind of a critter is this, you know? And so she read on, and I said, that sounds very unlikely. 7,000 soldiers and 8 soldiers. I mean, I was pointing out some difference in there. And she said, it's in the Bible. And she fingered the Bible again very sharply. And so I took the Bible, I opened it up, and I said, who is Deuteronomy or whatever? And she said, well, he wrote for the Bible too. I thought it was God's work. And who's this guy, John? And he has a big section in here. He wrote this too? Yes, but he was speaking with the voice of God. Now, that's enough. Close the book, close the book. And she went back to reading her notes for what she was trying to teach us that week. And but she was very alert as to whether I might interrupt her again. And at the end of the class, we got up and left, and they questioned me before I left, and he said, why are you asking all these questions? I said, it's a classroom, and I thought I could ask questions. How do you know that's true? But never mind. And they gave me a note to take to my parents, and it simply said in there something to the effect that your boy Randy is, that's my real first name, you see, is not necessarily welcome here at St. Cuthbert's because he asks too many questions and he interrupts the teachers. And so my mother and my father looked at that. They said, oh, that you can go back next week. It's okay, don't worry. I think they were happy to get rid of me on Sunday mornings. It just occurred to me that's probably why it was. But in any case, I went back the next Sunday morning with a quarter in my hand. And as I was mounting the stairs to St. Cuthbert's Church, I said, oh, wait a minute now. Gary lives near here. I had a boyfriend named Gary, and he was just around the corner. So I hustled around the corner, knocked on the door, and he was sleepy, and he woke up. He said, what's up? And I said, I've got a quarter. Let's go up to Purdy's Drugstore. Purdy's Drugstore on Bayview Avenue. Look it up. My memory is sharp in this respect, not in other respects, but in this one. And we found out that for 25 cents, which I had in my little fist there, you could get a 2-flavor ice cream sundae. Butterscotch marshmallow sprang to mind. And poor Gary had to have a butterscotch sundae. He only had 15 cents. That was his allowance, you see. And I lorded it over him forever. But that was a great lesson to learn. Yeah, that you didn't have to go to Sunday school. You could use that quarter to buy a double-flavor ice cream sundae at Purdy's.
So,
and they never found out. My parents, that I know of, never found out.
so you were a skeptic of religion before being a skeptic of paranormal, which
yes. But I looked at it with the same flavor.
Same flavor. Yeah. But in 1964, you had a radio talk show, or you were on a radio talk show, and you offered $1,000 of your own money in a challenge to anyone to show evidence of supernatural powers.
That's right.
What was the start of that? What caused you to do that?
Well, I used to, I had a good friend, Long John Neville. Some of you may recognize that name. Oh, thank you. Long John Neville was on late night radio on WOR, AM, and FM. And it was a 100,000 watt station. Now that's incredible. And if you're in the radio business, you would know that you couldn't get away with that kind of power nowadays. That would drown out so many small FM stations and everything else. And but it was run out of a pig farm in Secaucus, New Jersey, and the aroma was not pleasant. But the advantage of having a transmitter out there, that was the transmitter, not the broadcast studio, just a little studio this big. And the advantage of having the station on that location was that you never had to pay for fluorescent tubes. The radioactivity from 100,000 watts just above your head lit all of the fluorescent tubes. You went to the cupboard and opened it, it just blinded you. And they did burn out eventually. The phosphor wears out, you see. And when they changed tubes, they just stuck them on the wall. They had Velcro on the back of them. They just stuck them on the wall because they didn't have to be plugged in. There are certain advantages to radioactivity, you see, apparently. And I could tell you whole stories, rafts of stories about WOR, but that's the way the broadcast first took place. And then, a matter of a few weeks after that, now this is before I had the program, that's when Long John Neville had it. Mm-hmm. And it eventually moved to New York, 1440 Broadway, right above Times Square. And I was a frequent guest. In fact, I was the first few guests on John's show because I had to do various characters. Yes, I was Dr. Kieselgar in one. That's a fertilizer from Germany. It had nothing to do with my name, but it was as close as I could get to. And I used the name Dr. Kieselgar. It's still on sale, I'm told, for barnyards and such. And I was the Great M. I was several different characters. One night, when John was doing his program, he was astonished when he asked me a question to try to catch me, you see. He said, "I understand you've got a new book out, Doctor." And I was unprepared for that. But I answered him quickly back, and I said, "Yes, I do." And he looked stunned like that because he knew I didn't have a new book out. And he said, "What's the name of your book?" Trying to get me again, you see. And I said, "Natalopum Sock." He said, "What?" "Natalopum Sock." "Oh, you don't speak Urdu." He said, "Oh, I don't speak Urdu." And he started to laugh, you see, off microphone. And then I pointed out to a magazine that was sitting on the table. Natalopum Sock is cosmopolitan, spelled backwards. And I just put it down. Well, John broke up and left the studio, and I could hear him hooping and hollering out in the hall there. And I had to carry the rest of the program myself pretty well that night. But no, it was a good adventure. But then John decided that he was going to move to WNBC, which he did eventually. And I don't know the exact year of that, but I'm sure you probably have it in the notes someplace. But he gave notice to the station. But the station didn't take him seriously. And when the day arrived, when he wasn't going to be there that same night, I got a call. I was living out in New Jersey, 75 miles away. And I got a call from the station saying, "Can you come into the station tonight, Mr. Randi? Long John is not going to be with us." Now, I knew that he was leaving that night, but the station didn't know. They didn't take him seriously when he said he was resigning. And so I had to go in there and sit down in his chair and do the show from scratch. And I carried it for a year and a half until I was fired. I was fired. Now, let me tell you how I was fired. Funny I should mention that. I did the program one night and got back home. I was just asleep in New Jersey. The phone rang, picked it up, and it was Jim McAleer, who was the program director. And Jim said, "Get out here right away, back to the station." And he hung up the phone. What's going on? So I got out and got in my car, very sleepy, drove off to Manhattan, parked the car, went upstairs, and there was a whole bunch of lawyers and most of the top management of WOR sitting right there at this big office. I said, what's up? And one of the big bosses read from a piece of paper. He said, last night on the radio program on WOR, you said that Jesus Christ was a religious nut. And I looked at him and I said, no, I didn't. Yes, you did. I said, no, I didn't. I said, there's such a crowd in New York tonight in Times Square that if a man were to show up dressed in sandals and a robe, with a beard, carrying a sign saying, I'm Jesus Christ and I've just come back, they would lock him up as a religious nut. And we let it go at that. The people in the studio sort of laughed a bit, and then we went on with the program. I thought nothing of it whatsoever. I said, I didn't say that. They said, yes, we've listened to the tape. We know that you didn't actually say that, but the Archbishop of New York says that you did say that. So you said it. Understand? I said, no, I don't understand. And I walked out and I quit, just like that. Now, that was a well-paying job, the best one I'd ever had in my life. But I walked out and never went back.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
What role did the Houdini's model play in your life of a magician, escape artist, illusionist, becoming an educator to the public about paranormal claims? And
Well, when I first found out about Houdini, of course, I read several books on him, some of his biographical material as well, of course. And I saw that he was against all paranormal beliefs and such, and he even, Fooling with the Spirits was a program he did on vaudeville with his wife Beatrice, as a matter of fact, where they did a fake mind-reading act, and that exposed the whole thing. That went on for some time on the Orpheum circuit, yes. And so I thought, that's a good attitude to have. And I knew that the paranormal, from what I'd seen of it, and seen it by the street performers and whatnot, it was strictly phony. And so I decided that would be a good attitude for me to take too, because I greatly admired Harry Houdini, of course, who in way back when, just died just before my birthday. I mean, things happened to me at the wrong time. That's all there is to it. He died 2 years before my birthday, as a matter of fact. And I thought that would be a good example. So I sort of took up being Harry Houdini, though I never claimed to be him. And as a matter of fact, during my career, I broke a couple of his records. But I must add very quickly that when I broke the records that Houdini had established, like being sealed in a coffin underwater with no additional oxygen, etc., I broke it by a very slight margin, purposely, because I didn't want to outdo it, because I was a good 20 years younger than he was when he did it. You see, he did some of these records shortly before he died. He didn't die as a result of any of the experiments, but or stunts. But I thought that was not fair to say that I had broken his record because I was so sufficiently younger at the time.
I'd like to jump ahead to one of the investigations and trips that you and I and Jim Alcock and Barry Carr were on.
Phil Klass.
And Phil Klass, the late Phil Klass, and
Yes.
Paul Kurtz.
Yes.
Our trip to Beijing, China in 1988 to investigate a whole variety of paranormal claims. We were invited by the editor of a Science Daily newspaper to come bring particularly Randi's expertise to examine these claims that were getting publicity all over the world. Well, I want to set the scene, though, for what it was like in Beijing, China, and Randi there in 1988. This was not the modern commercial China we have today. This was just coming out of the Maoist period. Yeah. A lot of people on the streets were still dressed in very gray, drab clothes. There were tens of thousands of bicycles, very few cars. And here we were with the great Randi, the amazing Randi, in his cape and beard and black hat on the streets of Beijing, and it was quite a sight.
Yes, it was indeed. And it was a great adventure.
It was indeed.
We had a very good time, but not only we had a good time, but we learned about Mr. Ding.
Mr. Ding, yes.
You remember Mr. Ding?
Mr. Ding had was getting worldwide publicity for a number of young children, girls, I think. No, they were all girls.
They were girls and boys.
Girls and boys who claimed to be able to do paranormal
Oh, no, you're talking
things.
about the parapsychologist, Mr. Ding. Yeah, there was another Mr.
we
Ding.
had a Mr. Ding on our side.
Our guide and interpreter.
A young man named Mr. Ding also. So there we have two Mr. Dings. Yeah.
Well, that Mr. Ding, you know what happened to that Mr. Ding?
Which one?
Good. Just testing him. Yeah, sure. Now, the Mr. Ding who was our interpreter.
Oh,
I think
I know he became a wealthy entrepreneur.
Well, almost.
Really?
Mr. Ding used to come in every day during our breakfast time, and he was a skinny kid, and he was rather excited because he had just finished his examinations at university. Now, in their system, I believe they had 30 points were available to them. You got the top score, you had 30 points. And so every day that he came in, he said the first day that he was waiting for his results. And I said, oh, yes, when would you expect? He said, anytime at all. He said, and if I get a good mark, I'm going to have a scholarship at UCLA. And I said, wait a minute. I was saying to the other guys, I'll bet you every kid thinks that he's going to go to UCLA if he gets high enough marks. But it was an innocent enough remark because, with millions of kids at that age in vast country like China, I suspected that was true. But every day we dutifully asked him, did you get your results yet? No, not yet, but they said they were in the mail. Okay. The last day that we stayed there, I don't know if you remember this.
I don't remember this
Okay.
part.
We were in a rather shoddy hotel that particular time. I remember that. I remember all shoddy hotels, so watch it. And Ding walked in with a smile from here to here. And I looked up at him and I said, Ding, you got your results? And he smiled even wider and he said, yes, and I'm going to UCLA. And I had sort of a foreboding. I wonder if this is what every kid who graduates in Beijing thinks is going to happen. And he said, we're just waiting for the certificate to come now. And I said, well, may I ask, what was your score? And then I saw his face change, and I thought, oh, I'm sorry if that's too personal. Because the Chinese then, and I'm sure as now, were very sensitive about asking questions about family or anything like that if you didn't know them very well. You see, and I said, if you don't want to answer. And he looked, and he said, the number? And I said, yes, the number. And he was so shy, he wrote it down. Perfect score. He didn't expect to get anything less than that. That's the way the Chinese educational system is. They all expect to get top scores. I wish we could have a little more of that thinking in the American educational system too, as a matter of fact. But he had the top score, and no wonder he was grinning from ear to ear, you see. And so he went on. He is now the 5th wealthiest man in China. And, oh yes, and, well, that was as of about 2 years ago. But I don't know, maybe he's only the 4th now. I'm not sure. But I got to tell you, this business of asking personal questions about family and such like that is so strong with these people. They're very shy about it. And I have to, when I got to the United States, I bought him a bicycle. That is, he hadn't come over yet. And I was in Los Angeles. I was doing some date there. Bought him a nice yellow bicycle with a bell. And I knew that would be very handy for him as a UCLA student and such. And I bought him the bicycle. And a couple of weeks later, he arrived, and I got a call from him. But he was very quiet. And he said, how did you know I was coming? I said, you told me the date. He said, Yes, but how did you get the bicycle? In his country, he had to wait a year and a half to get a bicycle after paying for it. And for an automobile, it was 2.5 years. And probably still is, I don't know. But he was amazed that I could just walk into a bicycle store and say, I'll take that one. Because you couldn't do that in China. As a matter of fact, he told me later that he spent hours in Ralph's grocery, the all-night grocery in Los Angeles, in California in general. And he said he would be walking around with a friend of his who had been there for a year already and saying, could I buy this? Yes, you can buy anything. Then you just put it in the wagon. Oh, okay. And he picked up a can that had a picture of a dog on it. And he said, oh, yes, I haven't had any of that in a long time. And then when we explained to him that we fed that to dogs, he said, why? He didn't understand. No, we feed them scraps and whatever, and some special, here are the special foods. He didn't understand this way of life. He was astonished at every turn, every place he went. And Ding ended up leaving UCLA, and he moved off to Dallas, I think it was. To Dallas. And he invented a system for UCLA, which they still use today, which enables every incoming student to sign a form that gives him access to fraternities and sororities and all the different organizations on campus. And UCLA had never had a good system for that, and they use the Ding system to this day. And, more importantly, are you ready for this? He changed his name.
Oh.
His name was Jian Ding, originally, pardon me. He's now known as James Ding.
James Ding.
In my honor. That's something. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Jim Alcock in his presentation, and I think Massimo Polidoro showed a film clip that Phil Klass took during the Chinese investigations of this woman writhing on a table while the Qigong master is in the other room doing his thing, and she is supposedly responding to it, but you set up the controlled conditions where she didn't know when he was doing his thing, and vice versa, and I was the record keeper there. So it was a fairly astonishing thing for us to see.
Yeah.
Describe what you remember about that.
Well, I remember that the Qigong master wasn't very happy about that when we suggested the protocol for it. But the woman on the table she must have been very embarrassed because he would be going through his things like this, and we'd put up a screen and the whole business, and she would suddenly start kicking like crazy, as you see in the film. Boom, 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 like that. And then she would open her eyes and look around as if to get a hint as to whether she should have done that. She was rather disconcerted, to say the least. I was sort of embarrassed because it caught them out that it just didn't work because she didn't move when he signaled, and when he signaled, she didn't move.
There's no relationship between the two at all whatsoever, despite what they thought. What about what are your memories about the Matchbox Children that the other Mr. Ding was the mentor for?
That was, well, there were two Mr. Dings, as you said earlier. Yeah. One of the Mr. Dings was a parapsychologist. Yes. Who ran these tests with the kids, and the kids got away with such lax conditions. It was just ridiculous. They were supposed to tell how many matches were in a box with a certain color on them or whatever, or what the colors were, and Mr. Ding ran them for and they were always right, except that one of the little sort of flaws in the experimental protocol, in my mind, was that they were allowed to go out into the schoolyard and play around with it, and maybe even peek into the boxes, if you could imagine that. We suspected them of that, but of course that Chinese children wouldn't do a thing like that, would they? And they were always right, until we taped up the boxes. And they didn't understand why we would tape up the boxes. Well, maybe because you're peeking, I don't know. But the experiment rather failed at that point. Yeah. And Mr. Ding was now this Mr. Ding apparently went to prison. He was, the Chinese government eventually caught on to this,
Yes.
and they decided this was a disgrace to the Republic of China.
Let's go to another. Criticisms of you. I know that's.
Of me?
Yeah.
Impossible.
We used to hear it. I don't think we've heard it in a long time. But back then, sometimes people would say about you, oh, you're just a magician. What do you know about scientific investigation? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, what do you know? Yeah. How did that... And then another one was you're biased or closed-minded. What did you
my
say
mind
about,
is perfectly open if you want to take a look at it. I think my mind is pretty open, and you can see right here. I show my head very freely, and you can almost read right through it. But I don't have scientific training, that's true. No, I learned in high school in Canada. I must say, I learned much more physics and chemistry than the average American child at that day and time learned. We were, when we got out of high school in Canada, we were 1 year ahead of New York schools, as a matter of fact, in our learning spectrum, let's put it that way. So we were much better informed. We were pretty well ready to go into first year college.
So that's where it was in high school. Because I was going to ask you how you became so knowledgeable about science and the processes of science to impress the worldwide scientific community with your knowledge and skills. And
I must say, I owe it, a lot of it, to Mr. Tavel, our physics teacher. Now, we never knew our teachers' first names. We never called them. It was always Mr. Tavel or Miss Quayle or whatever. We addressed them that way. This was in Canada then. I don't know about today. It's probably changed enormously. But that's the way we were in those days. And Mr. Tavel was our physics teacher. Brilliant man. I only found out a matter of about 3 or 4 years ago, I found a reference to him. And it turned out he was much more qualified than for just a high school teacher. And I don't know why he took that position, but he was brilliant. Mr. Tavel would do wonderful things like, we always got a 2-minute bell. There would a bell ring in the hall 2 minutes before we would change classes to either march to another class. And when he heard that 2-minute bell, he would go to the blackboard and he would uncover something that he'd written on the blackboard the previous day or the previous night. And it would be often something like a perpetual motion machine. And he would say, this doesn't work. Tomorrow, I'm going to ask you a few pertinent questions about whether it does work or not. And if you think it does work, we'll build it and we'll see whether it works. That was the kind of teacher he was. This was off the books. This was way off the books.
Now this goes to show you what a really great science teacher can
Oh,
do.
yes. Oh, yes. Any teacher of any kind.
Of any type.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But particularly of science. Yeah. And he was a great teacher that way. And to this day, I can remember so many wonderful machines and things that he built for us that weren't in the book. They just weren't in the book. And he would ask us in advance whether the ball would go down here or whatever, and we had to figure it out, and we had to come up with the right answer. So good teachers. And Mr. Chrysler, my English teacher, and Mr. Henderson, my mathematics teacher, who I bothered for analyst days, I'm sure, after hours, asking him to tell me what integral calculus was all about, because we didn't take integral calculus, well, calculus in general at that time. And today I can do a dy over a dx rather swiftly, I think. I actually got to use calculus, and I was interested, and I did this at home.
Well, obviously you could have become a PhD if you had wanted to, if you cared to go that route.
A real food?
What?
A real food.
You could?
I could have. Well, yes, but I...
Who cares?
Well, I didn't want to go that way. Yeah. Well, it came about at the Casino Theater. Casino Theater, wrecked long ago. It's only a pile of dust someplace on Queen Street. But I saw the great Harry Blackstone. Harry Blackstone. If any of you are amateur magicians, you will know right away who Harry Blackstone was. Not Harry Blackstone Jr., who I also knew and met, of course, but the senior, and Harry Blackstone. He levitated a woman, levitated a living woman on stage. Now, that's not easy to do. No, well, I thought it wasn't easy to do. It's actually pretty easy to do. But he stood
At some
back.
point, I want to learn about that. But let's tell me about your books. Which of all your books is your favorite, and which is more successful if they're not the same one?
Flim Flam is probably the most successful.
Flim Flam.
Yeah, with an exclamation point, please, and a hyphen.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's very important. Yes, Flim Flam really is the most general book on my investigations of the paranormal and the supernatural claims that they're so infesting our society today and many years ago, of course. And the book, I've forgotten when it was printed even. It was in the year 1, I think it was, a very long time ago. But it sold very, very well.
Yeah.
And Flim Flam, I think, would come second to that.
Tell us about your book that is completed, I understand, but not yet published, Magician in the Laboratory. What is that about?
Not in the lavatory, it's laboratory. Just in case you... Yes. Yeah. Magician in the Laboratory, it's with 2 different publishers now who are trying to decide whether they want to publish it. Or also we're trying to decide whether we want them to publish it. But they're considering it. It's going to be a large book. Well, not that large, but maybe a little thicker than the average book that I would write. And it's going to deal with my visits to laboratories all over the world, in almost every country in the world, over these many years that I've had traveling, where these scientists thought they had something discovered, something paranormal, something supernatural, whatever. And I would go into the laboratories and show them where their errors were. And they were not very happy about it, particularly in Russia. They were not happy about it at all. And I came in for all kinds of scolding. And I was told by 2 of the scientists who were present, young fellows that were present, months afterwards, I got letters from them saying that the man in charge of the whole thing said they would never let a magician in the laboratory again. Because I showed them where they were so wrong. Now, a magician is showing scientists where they're wrong. Come on, that's not very logical at all. But I knew enough about science and about the way it works and doesn't work. That's the second thing you got to know is how it doesn't work. So those 2 books have been my best sellers, I believe. And The Faith Healers was a great success for me too.
When Carl Sagan wrote the introduction to the Faith Healers, is
Yes.
that right? And he said many kind things about you, but he also had some criticisms for you.
Oh yes.
And I'm trying to find the note here, but he referred to you as crotchety.
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 Yes, you got to spell the word correctly. Yeah. I am crotchety. Yes.
Oh.
I certainly am. Yes. He couldn't quite understand that I actually blew my mind sometimes and got very angry, particularly at the so-called faith healers and people who were supposed to be bringing relief to the people.
I think
who were
he was
suffering.
saying it in a positive way.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, he meant it in a positive way. I hope. I don't know.
Well,
Carl, did you mean that or not?
Carl was a good friend of all of ours and an
yes.
immense supporter, and
Very much.
You and he were mutual fans, and but I always just found, and I recently reread that sentence in the introduction, and I thought it just stuck out to me.
Yeah, yeah, it came out to a lot of people. They asked me questions about that. But I must say, on the subject of Carl Sagan, it was revealed not too long ago now that he was a great pot user.
Yes, yeah.
Marijuana, that is. And I read that, and I was really sort of nonplussed because I thought, Carl, puffing a weed, twisted at each end. I know about that because some friends of mine showed it to me. And then I thought, wait a minute, I've got to think about this now. And when I read, and he wrote quite an extensive couple of articles on his use of marijuana that you should look up, because he explained himself very well. He found that it did make his mind wander a bit and go into avenues where it might not normally have gone. Yeah. Now, there's a mysterious thing we got up here in between these bones. And, well, for me at least, I don't know about you individually, but I had to just rear back and stare at the wall and say, damn, if Carl thought it was a good thing, I won't try it, and I have never tried it. Never tried any psychedelic or any dope, so-called, of any kind. I've never been drunk in my life. I enjoy a glass of wine every now and then, but that's it. If it was good enough for Carl, and he got some inspiration out of it, I almost feel that I want to try it myself. Maybe it might help in some way, but I don't trust myself to be able to do that and walk away from it. Thank you.
In November 2014, the New York Times published an article about you in the magazine, New York Times Magazine, The Unbelievable Skepticism of the Amazing Randi. It was quite a wonderful, very detailed, lengthy, revealing article. How is that? How did you see it, and how has it affected you?
Oh, it was a good article. I liked it very much. There were a couple of things I might have ironed out a little bit. By that I mean to explain them a little more, perhaps. But in the New York Times, after all, you would expect high standards, and we got them. I was Davey and I, my partner, Davey and I, we were very, very happy with the results of it. It was done kindly and decently, and I was satisfied with it in most ways, and certainly the illustrations were very good. We're very flattered by it. I have a number of copies at home, as you might imagine.
Let me mention a few things that were said. For many of his most zealous followers, the opportunity to meet Randi at TAM, your conference, may be as close as they will ever come to a religious experience.
That's true. Bless you, bless you.
Let's see. He, Randi, said he disliked being called a debunker. He prefers to describe himself as a scientific investigator. I don't set out to debunk. I think that's fair, right?
Yeah, oh no, I am a debunker, yes, by definition, but I think scientific investigator covers it better because I try to be scientific. I don't have the credentials for that at all, but I have met the approval of many leading scientists, including Carl Sagan,
indeed.
And many, many other people around the world in that respect. So I accept it, and I do try to be as scientific as I possibly can, and I'm not afraid to phone people up and ask them for advice on how I should state something to make sure that I have it as accurately as I can.
And then you talked about this person we have kept in the background here. Randi's campaign against Geller helped make them both more famous than ever. Even today, Geller credits Randi with helping him become a psychic phenomenon. My most influential and important publicist, as Geller described him to me.
What do I think of that?
Yeah, what do you think of that?
I think this is what do they call it? A delusion on the part of Mr. Geller. Yes, a very dramatic. He likes to think of it that way, that I made him. But he was well famous as a so-called psychic long before I was called by the New York Times, Time Magazine. Time Magazine to go in and investigate him. That investigation, that was fun. You have no idea. Geller, with his great psychic powers even, didn't know that I was a magician and that I knew how he was doing it. How would he not have known that? Now, I sat on the back of the chair that he was, big stuffy chair there, in John Derniak's, I don't know whether John is still with us. John, are you? No answer. I guess he's still with us then. John Derniak was the photo editor of the Time magazine, and he invited us to his office because they said they had this fellow appearing who had insisted there be no magicians present. So I thought that was a grand idea to be present. And so Charlie Reynolds, do you know the name Charlie Reynolds? No, he was the editor of Popular Photography magazine for many years, and he was a very, very accomplished magician as well. In fact, he invented several magic tricks. And he was a very close friend of mine for many, many decades. And he was sitting over in that part of the room, and I was sitting on this part of the room. We were facing one another, and Geller was sitting right here. And at one point, Geller bent a spoon, and he looked at it, and he showed it to me. He said, "Did you see that?" And I looked at him. I said, "Yes, Mr. Geller, I did see that." and he just looked hesitating, and then he put the spoon down and went on with something else. But I think it tipped to him at that moment, yes. Yes, that was sort of a revelation to him, because I said in that pleasant way, "I did see that."
Now, a biography of you is being written by Massimo Polidoro.
Yes.
How's that going, and what's the status, and how do you like having a book written about you?
Well, that's happened before. No, I'm a very close friend of Massimo's. I've known him since he was about so big. And he's actually lived at my home for quite some period of time, and brushed up on his English while doing that. And he's now a famous writer in Italy, his homeland, and he writes in both English and in Italian. And that's quite a talent now. And I'm proud to say that I did something towards teaching him English in my primitive way, of course, because I'm not really a teacher, you see. But no, I'm pleased to have it in Massimo's hands. But Massimo has agreed to suspend activity on the book because he has so many other projects going all at the same time. He's done very well for himself in that respect. And he has, as I say, agreed to suspend action on that until my next book comes out, because it's going to be very much autobiographical as well.
Now, this is which?
A Magician in the Laboratory.
The Magician in the Laboratory.
Yeah.
It'll be autobiographical about your life as well as about your work in scientific laboratories.
I get a chance to express that. But Massimo will come out with his version, of course, from a different point of view, and that's quite understandable. He already has written a very, very good book on the story of Harry Houdini, history of Harry Houdini, among so many other books. But buy it. That's all there is to it. We need the money. No, he needs nothing from us, believe me. He's very famous in Italy and now in this country. That's my good friend Massimo Polidoro. Are you here, Massimo? Okay, so much for friends. Okay.
Well, you can read him in the Skeptical Inquirer every issue, too.
Oh, yes, he writes columns in there all the time.
In 2015, out came a documentary movie about you, An Honest Liar. And Ruth and I were very privileged to be among the audience in Sydney, Australia. You were on your Australian tour after the Australian Skeptics Congress there 2 years ago, or a little less. And you were in the audience in Sydney, the last stop on the tour, which was sort of one of the main openings of that movie. I'm interested, how many here have seen the movie, The Honest Liar? Wow.
Oh, my goodness.
Good.
And it's all true. Oh, that's flattering.
Well, I found it a powerful and emotionally moving movie. I assume you agree.
Oh, yes, I do. And I must explain to those of you who see it, and to those of you who haven't, which I find very surprising, that there was a sequence in there, you'll all remember this, there was a point in the movie when I told the producers, an event had happened in my family, and I don't have to describe it in detail, that I didn't wish to be in the movie. And I told them in so many words, I said, now this must not appear in the film. This was on camera. I knew they were photographing it, filming it, pardon me. Well, not filming it, no, taping it, okay? I'll finally get it right. I'm still thinking the days of film. You may remember it had holes along the edge.
Yes.
But I said to them that this must not be used, etc. But it was less than 24 hours later that I came to my senses. It was the next day after I had a chance to think about it. And I phoned them up and I said, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be honest about these things. And I can't have it that way. That sequence has got to go back in again. Any way you want. Just put it back in again, because it's got to be the true story of my life. And it turned out to be that. And the reaction we were getting to it, it's now dubbed in 8 different languages, subtitles, that is, all over the world. And it just showed in Russia, I think, for the first time a couple of months ago.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's on YouTube, not on YouTube, it's on Netflix. So you look it up on Netflix. An Honest Wire.
How has it changed your life? Or
The movie?
yeah, the movie.
Yes.
How?
Well, in odd ways that you might not realize. If Davey and I, if we go out to a department store or something, not in our immediate neighborhood, there's always somebody way across the store, Mr. Randi, and they come running at me. I saw your movie. Oh, and the whole thing. They recognize both of us, of course. It has made a great deal of difference, and I feel good because the true story is out there and it's available to everybody. The producers of the film did a very, very good job, and all with my approval, I assure you.
That event in Sydney, Australia that I mentioned, towards the end, well, for one thing, you were interviewed on stage or had a conversation sort of like this with someone you and I both admire, a CSICOP fellow named Dick Smith.
Dick Smith, what a common name. Dick Smith.
And Dick is not very well known here in the United States, but he's a legend in Australia. One of their national treasures, literally designated a national treasure of Australia.
That's right. And on the copy of Time magazine about 6 or 8 times now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, over the years.
But you were asked a question from the audience that I thought was very revealing, something about you.
Oh, he made notes.
Well, I wrote about it later in my editorial column in the Skeptical Inquirer. I thought you were asked how to treat a friend who ardently believes in the paranormal. And you said, be kind, be kind. They believe because they need to believe. Be compassionate. And I wanted to ask you if that is a new Randi, or is that the Randi of old?
No, it's not a new Randi at all, but since I began these investigations, I found that these people, they believed in it so much and they needed it so much that to disabuse them of the notion was often very difficult to do. Now, at showings of An Honest Wire, if they're in Florida, we can often drive to them and with some delight and show up for a Q&A following the film. And those are always rather exciting and very good sessions. However, as you might suspect, we often get exactly the same questions for the first 6 or 8 questions. Most questions that we would expect to get. And those are easy to answer. Although I usually say, that's a good question. That's a lot. It was just a very common question. But I don't want them to feel that they were not original, you see. So I will answer the question, or Davey will answer the question. And then you get one that really shakes you up, and that's a different thing altogether. And I take great joy in answering that, and we usually put it into our memory as something that we'll come back to later on. But those question and answer periods are ended when the audience finally leaves. Big round of applause, the whole thing. Am I still on mic? Okay, because I don't sound like I'm on mic to my ears. And no, I'm not.
Whoa!
I didn't do anything at all. Here, wait a minute.
Someone's
Has it moved?
There.
Is that better?
There.
Gotcha. Yeah. Am I being heard properly now? Okay, thanks. I'll just keep my face like this then. When we ask we do these Q&A things afterwards, and the audience leaves, without throwing any stones usually, there's always 6 or 8 people left behind, Ken, that come to the foot of the stage, look up at us, hello,
Yep.
look up at us, and they'll come up with the same statement as if it were written out there for them to read. And they say, "You made a big change in my life," often with tears coming down their faces. Now, folks, you cannot buy that. That's the greatest compliment we can possibly have. And they will try to, and they will in many cases successfully explain how what we said in that film actually changed their minds in some way or another. And as I say, that's very, very flattering. And we know we made it. You know, the film worked, and it worked well. And we get letters from all over the world now, from people who say exactly the same thing. That's very flattering. And bear that in mind.
So it's clear to you, they make that clear to you that
Yeah.
you have made a difference in their life,
Yeah.
in their lives.
Yeah, and if you get to chat with them afterwards in detail, sometimes that happens as well. It takes a lot of time, but it's worth spending the time on it. They will explain in detail how they used to believe in some preacher or other, and they sent him all kinds of money, and they had to go to the bank, and they had to borrow money because he was demanding more money from them and such. And when you hear this, you know how much you hate those bastards, the preachers and such. What they've done to these people. They've led them astray, they've appeared to do miracles of some kind, and they've won these people over, and they've cost them fortunes in many cases.
I want to briefly ask you about another experience I recall. It was an CSICOP Executive Council meeting in London, and we were at a restaurant, and you were bending the cutlery, surprisingly.
Me? Would I do a thing like that?
And a waiter was watching very intently, and it became very clear he was quite emotional about it. And he eventually came over, and it was clear something was very strongly affecting him. And I don't recall whether it was that he had seen you debunking the idea that spoon bending is a paranormal phenomenon. I think that's what it was, or whether he maybe thought you were a paranormal person yourself. But I recall you going over and taking him aside and talking to him privately about that to comfort him. And I don't know quite what was said, but you did do that, and I don't know if you remember that experience at all.
Well, I've had to do that occasionally to explain to people there are ways of doing this, and then just do it right in front of their eyes. And they, how did you do that? Well, when I gestured with the spoon like this, and I said to you, "Now come over here." And as I turned away, and you didn't notice that, and then I concealed the bend, or I explained to them how I did the thing, and then they suddenly dawned on them, yes, it's very easy actually because Mr. Geller did turn around and walk to the other side of the room, and when he turned around again, he was covering most of the spoon with his hand. I couldn't see that whether it was bent or not, because that's the way Geller does it. It's the easy way.
We're getting close to the end of our time for this interview, but I wanted to ask you,
for the interview.
our time for this interview, this conversation. None of us are as young as we used to be. You've had health challenges, a heart attack, I believe, colon cancer, something you and I have shared.
I had cardiac bypass and everything, yeah.
Cardiac bypass, aneurysms in your leg, cataracts, I don't know what else, and yet you have persevered. So I think we all want to know, how are you doing? How are you doing health-wise? And how are you, really?
Well, I've recently had a couple of TIAs. Those are transient ischemic attacks, and that really stands for a minor stroke. I lost the use of my right arm temporarily for a matter of a few minutes, but hey, it's back again, yes. I can use it very well. As a matter of fact, my hands are exceedingly flexible, if you notice. Yes, and no, I'm doing very well, For 88, I only feel like 86. True.
What do you have any final words for the generation?
No final words.
No. You don't like that word.
No, wait a minute. I got to tell you what he asked me previously.
You wrote it down.
He said, he was talking about the arrangements for this evening, and he said to me, well, that about does it. Any last requests? I wrote it down because that's what you asked me. You see, he's got to be careful of how you form your words, you know.
All right. Do you have any words, final or not, for the people who love you and the next generation of skeptical inquirers who need to be reminded why the next generation of young people who need to be reminded why scientific skepticism is so important?
There are people out there that are called magicians. They should be more correctly called conjurers. That's the UK expression for it, and it's much more accurate. A conjurer, by dictionary definition, is someone who approximates the effects of a genuine magician. A genuine magician would be somebody who can do magic, miracles of some kind, lesser or greater. But a conjurer is a much better expression for it, so I'll use that. A conjurer can fool you, and you have to be smart to be fooled. It's hard to fool small children for a funny reason, and you may not understand this, but think about it. They're not sophisticated enough to be fooled. Example. No, I'm not going to drink it. No, I don't know what's in this bottle, but I do know what the cap does. Now, white plastic, all right. Now, a thing like this is small enough that you can conceal it. It doesn't go up my sleeve or anything like that, but it goes away for some reason. It happens to be down here because that's where I dumped it. The point is, with children, they want to see it go from here to there and the hand closed on it. You didn't require that. I just simply did this, and I held it back here, you see. But the children are not sophisticated enough to know that that's what you would do if you were transferring something from one hand to the other, that you could do it by this means as well. A miracle, a miracle. I don't know how it's done, and I don't care. So that's what I've often said, and people often ask me to demonstrate it. But children, and think of that now, they're not smart enough to be fooled. They haven't had enough experience of the real world and how things really happen in the real world to know what it would look like if I just transferred it from one hand to the other. So learn from that, okay?
I want to thank you, dear Randy. We all thank you.
Thank you so much.